You don't have a mic?
There is a mic. It doesn't work terribly well. We're going to project.
Vati, everyone. Ida Wangave. Ijaje Uwetike, Stacy Laravie, Ponca Ijaje Mecca A. Hello, friends and relatives. You've heard my English name. My Ponca name is Mecca A, which is star. And I'm not going to go on and talk about my life and who I am. You can read the bio on the thing. So, but tonight I wanted to talk to you about something that is very, very important in sciences. And it is a science and is probably the science that we should be actually seeking right now from Indigenous peoples across the world. I'm going to start off. Okay. Traditional knowledge. Traditional knowledge is the experience, skills, practices, insights, and values that are passed down generation to generation in Indigenous communities and cultures. They are the only scholars of their knowledge and identity. Specifically, we will discuss TIK, which is traditional Indigenous knowledge. And it's funny because, you know, we don't really have all these labels in our languages. So it's funny how everything has a label now. Here. Oh. Technology doesn't like me. Just like that. Some examples of traditional knowledge is traditional ecological knowledge, TEK, Indigenous knowledge, IK, which is TEK, language, cultural landscapes, oral histories, animal knowledge, kinships, foodways, songs and music, star knowledge, technologies, and so much more. And I can literally pinpoint Indigenous knowledge into every science, and even in the health field, everywhere I go. And throughout this presentation, you will hear me mention all these different traditional knowledge examples. I cannot talk about any of this without mentioning generational trauma. It all is so interconnected. If trauma never happened, I wouldn't be standing here telling you why traditional knowledge is important. Under each point are hundreds of topics and examples I could break down and spend weeks on just one. But we don't have time for that. The first is colonization and assimilation. I call it ethnic cleansing. I think we all know what that is. Broken treaties and Trail of Tears was a trauma. Treaties were put in place between Native nations in the U.S. Although treaties were made between tribes long before contact, Native nations honored them. The U.S. government made treaties but were coerced and were not honored. The U.S. government made more than 300 treaties between 1778 and 1871. All were broken and violated. Every single one. 1830, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act. This was the beginning of removal of thousands of Native nations across the U.S. were removed from their sacred homelands. My Ponca relatives were one of the many Native tribes that was removed to Oklahoma Territory on the Ponca Trail of Tears in northern Nebraska. And they walked actually 600 miles or so there and back and there and back. Although Indigenous people have been migrating since the dawn of time, this was a natural process. Migration was a natural way of existence. The Trail of Tears was a forced march to imprison Native peoples to the concentration camps in Oklahoma Territory and other areas that they were not familiar with. And right here is my gaha and Machunaji, Chief Standing Bear. This is my great-great-grandmother, Fanny. This is his wife, and these are a few of his other relatives. And Standing Bear actually walked the Trail of Tears with the Ponca. And if I won't go into that whole story, but I suggest you do your research on the Ponca Trail of Tears and every other Trail of Tears story. Back here. What? Oh. There's no back button.
Don't mind us. Just ironing out our details here.
Okay, I'm gonna use this.
There you go.
That would be good.
That's better. Perfect. There we go.
Usually I don't make PowerPoints. I just wing it. I'm like, it'll be good. People can use their imagination. So this picture right here is actually Fanny Standing Bear's husband, Alfred Laravie. He is my great-great-grandfather, and he went to Carlisle, him and his twin brother, Perry. March 3rd, 1819 began the Indian Civilization Act Fund. This fueled the adopting of Indian boarding schools. One of the most popular boarding schools is Carlisle, opened in 1879 in Pennsylvania. The Carlisle Indian Industrial School was the first government-run boarding school for Native Americans. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Henry Pratt spearheaded the off-reservation school. His tactics were militant, and the grounds were formerly a military post. Imagine that. The first students recruited were the Dakota Territory region. Soon to follow were many nations across the U.S. You might be walking around in this very community and see some of their descendants. Every nation was affected by boarding schools. This was the last-ditch effort to ethnically cleanse a culture and a people. The children were often held hostage to control Native nations' decision-making, the leaders, and the parents. By the 19th and 20th century, 523 boarding schools existed. By 1925, over 60,000 children were forcefully abducted and taken hundreds of miles away from their families and placed in boarding schools. Our children were abused for speaking their inherent language. This projected the Indigenous people in the trauma of losing language and culture and so much more. Pratt pushed this agenda of kill the Indian and save the man. These were his exact words. Today we fight to bring home our children. And this one right here, this is in Genoa, Nebraska. A lot of my relatives went there. This is in Carlisle. Some of the children were as young as 3 years old that were documented. Some were even younger. I find it very ironic. This is the train platform. The children were unloaded from the train here to attend Genoa. And this is you can find these steps in Genoa, Nebraska. And And I just find it irony. I don't like these steps. It's quite a depiction of a metaphoric way of the change that was to come. The children went on the trains as themselves and came off as a different person, a stranger to themselves and their families. It's almost a portal to assimilation. And some of you may have seen this picture. This is Henry Standing Bear, Wounded Yellow Robe, and Chauncey Yellow Robe. And, you know, I mean, what a vast difference there. And how blessed I feel that I today can be as Indigenous as I want and wear what I want. And I do it for them. This one may hit some pretty hard. I'm not going to sugarcoat anything in this presentation. Academia has played a crucial part in genocide of Indigenous peoples, destruction of sacred places and sites. I will clarify this. Archaeology and other ologies only tell part of the story. Traditional Indigenous knowledge tells the part of the story that cannot be told by non-Indigenous people. For example, one may see an area with plants around it. One would say, we have nothing here. The roadway project may move forward. Indigenous knowledge would say, the plant grouping and type of plant paints a picture that this was a traditional farm. Or one might say, this is just a waterfall or a spring. But to us, it is a sacred ancestral ceremonial place. Traditional Indigenous knowledge is science. Indigenous science is a valid source of knowledge. Take traditional ecological knowledge, TEK, looking at kinship and utilizing oral stories of plants. Indigenous people knew the cycle of life in an ecosystem. This showed us when to plant, harvest, where to plant, steward the land, burn, and use our means of conservation. Ignoring the voices of Indigenous people have catapulted the world into the environmental emergency we are in. Am I saying this is the sole reason for global warming? Yes and no. Plead the fifth on that. But to explain, I would need to at least have a couple weeks on that. Yeah. What is an expert? Oxford Dictionary says an expert is a person who has a comprehensive and authoritative knowledge or skill in a particular area. Keyword authoritative. Those from academia are not experts on Indigenous knowledge, nor do they have authority over it and how it is utilized. Only those who are of Indigenous communities have specialized expertise over traditional Indigenous knowledge. Just because you have academic credentials does not mean you know everything. Time and time again, I have seen non-Indigenous academia discredit traditional knowledge keepers. We can learn from one another. In order to do that, you must listen. Archaeology, anthropology, ecology, or any other ologies are to accent traditional knowledge, not dominate. Together, if done honorably, it can help paint the larger picture. And so this slide, Willie Jack. I don't know. I guess I've made that face quite a few times. And I'm like, well, don't make me make this Willie Jack face. Okay. Just don't do it. My kid's seen it quite a bit. So something you will learn as ARC students, Anthro students, and some of the other ologies, you'll learn about tribal consultation. And some will have to deal with Section 106. In your career, you may see this word sometimes, consultation. For Native nations, this can be a loaded word and almost as honorable as a treaty. I say that with sarcasm because just because someone says they consulted, they never really did. Let's see what the dictionary says about consultation. The action or process of formally discussing. What is tribal consultation? Tribal consultation is a formal two-way government-to-government dialogue. So that means two sides need to be discussing something. Between official representatives of tribal governments and feds, but sometimes you will need to consult with tribal reps who they send out, like THPOs, who you will meet in your field. You'll meet many tribal historic preservation officers if you're an ARC student or anthropology student, especially. But THPOs don't just limit themselves to that. I go down the rabbit hole of what a tribal historic preservation officer is, but we don't have time for that. So there's going to be, I'll send resources and you'll be able to look up all these terms and resources and everything that you should probably as students start learning now. This all falls under Section 106. Regardless, always consult. I could do a series just on Section 106. When you consult, you are bringing in traditional knowledge as well. If you are an archaeologist, you are contracting with a roadway construction crew to do a survey, you might think that is all clear to start construction, but a place could be seen as sacred. I could give a billion examples out in the field where someone's like, oh, we're good, or I get a letter saying we're going to proceed. I'm like, wait a minute. This may look like just rocks or a side of a rock for you, but this is a sacred place. This is where we hold our ceremonies or what have you. Every nation is different with consultation. Every nation is sovereign, meaning they are their own governments. So you have the U.S. federal government, and then you have all these different tribal nations, and those are separate governments, even separate governments from each other. So that word consultation can mean many things. One shoe does not fit everybody. Bottom line, consult, ask questions, consult, be open, and consult. Create relationships. And everything I'm discussing tonight is intertwined with each other. There's no separation. It affects one or the other or all. The power of place. Why is tribal consultation important? Consultation aids in protection of sacred places, burial places, and other traditional cultural properties or places known as TCPs. Indigenous knowledge is vital in identifying these places, traditional knowledge keepers, and language bearers are key in these efforts. Revitalization of Indigenous languages have aided in protecting many places and preserving them. The power of place is so intertwined with Indigenous knowledge. This knowledge is intertwined with the land, water, air, space, our animal relatives, plants, and us. Indigenous knowledge is in our songs, oral histories, and languages. It is important to support these efforts to tell the whole story. Indigenous people are so intertwined with place that the removal of us and keystone species have led to adverse effects on ecosystems. We worked with kinships, not against. Traditional Indigenous knowledge and language is critical, but also healing. Renaming a place or using the Indigenous word for that place and ancestral names breathe life back into that place. Languages also bring forth stories of the cultural landscape. Place names matter. Sometime in your life, you might come upon where you might be on a project helping to rename a place and working with other nations. I can tell you that in my research, all the waterways in Nebraska have a name, a Ponca name, because a joke is one of my colleagues, another THPO, said, "Man, you Poncas name everything." Well, glad we did. There's so much knowledge within our languages. Sharing information and sensitivities. Is that it? Is that all I did? Okay. Indigenous knowledge includes information that is sacred and sensitive to only be used by the tribe. This information should not be taken lightly. An unethical use of such information is prohibited, and this information should be protected. Sometimes information is already out there that was stolen. This information still belongs to the people or nation that has the inherent right to it. The majority of the time, the sharing of this information from an elder, traditional knowledge keeper, or tribal representative was thought out and had ceremony and prayer. This information is not given carelessly to anyone. These informants are experts and should be treated as such. The subject matter should be honored and respected. So basically, if you create relationships, don't expect knowledge to be given right away or anything. Don't expect anything. Just build that relationship. I suggest you research all you can. NAGPRA, Section 106, and everything I have mentioned. Learn about and create relationships with the Indigenous peoples in your communities. Share stories. I have a list of resources, like I said, so, well, oh wait, that one's not in there. Okay. I've just skimmed the surface and didn't even get to NAGPRA and repatriation or rematriation. So that'll have to be another time. I can literally find a place for Indigenous knowledge everywhere. It is your responsibility to engage and create relationships. Traditional knowledge isn't free. Any of the ologies is paid for their knowledge, so Indigenous knowledge should be honored the same way as other sciences. And I'll end with this. We talked about generational trauma. And I want to end with generational healing. We acknowledge what happened in the past to heal and for history not to repeat itself. What we do today has a ripple effect. We think of 7 generations ahead. My 3 times great-grandfather, Matriarch of the Ponca, didn't know the effect he would have on his people and descendants, or any indigenous people. He is exactly 7 generations before me, and he walks the trail of tears. It was the love for his son that moved him to do what he did. It was the love for his son that made him do what is right. Here I am, an outcome from his actions. I am humbled and honored to speak here today. I want you to know that what you do today matters. It really does. I want healing for the next 7 generations. And if you choose to do what's right, you will be part of that healing. Healing is sacred. It's easy to break things. I mean, look how much destruction has happened. And Native Americans were deemed human beings 1879. That was only like 144 years ago. So if you think of timelines, see how destructive we have made the world right now in that short amount of time. It's easy to break something, but it is so hard to heal. So what you do today really affects the future and the generations. Fight for Indigenous issues, policy change, civil injustice, and environmental issues, because it is all connected. Everything that you do in your life is connected one way or another, or will affect somebody in the future, or has affected somebody in the present. So the picture you see here, this is a beautiful Ponca couple. I just love this picture. I can't remember their names, but I love it. You don't see too many of these old photos of people smiling. So, man, she looks like I'm really happy. And of course, my grandfather, but that is my great-grandfather, Benjamin Laravie. Why am I showing you this? Because this picture you see here are the grandfathers and grandmothers of Indigenous people you see every day. That mound that you are studying in class is a burial of a grandfather. Those belongings in a museum were a grandmother's. Those remains sitting in a museum drawer is a relative and an ancestor to somebody. We who are the descendants, our knowledge matters because it came from those human beings. We call them relatives. We are doctors, we are lawyers, we are teachers. We remain and we are still here. So let's make some change. We will.